All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive, potentially existential energy vulnerability right at the heart of the world's third largest economy. We are looking at a situation that literally defines the geopolitics of an entire region, yet somehow it often goes completely unnoticed by the rest of the world until a crisis actually hits.
Picture this, a nation of 123 million people. They're churning out the absolute most advanced tech on the planet, right? Semiconductors, robotics, precision machinery, cutting-edge automotive engineering. It's a population that is fully 100% dependent on an uninterrupted flow of electricity, heating, and transportation just to keep its massive society functioning. And yet, to power all of this, this nation has to import a staggering 97% of its primary energy.
And this right here is the Japanese paradox in a nutshell. On one side of the ledger, you've got this absolute powerhouse of an economic engine producing $4.2 trillion in value. But on the other side, a domestic landscape that is completely unable to fuel that engine. I mean, Japan cannot produce a single solitary barrel of oil on its own soil. It is arguably the most energy-vulnerable great power on Earth.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of this vulnerability, let's use a simple visual analogy. Think of a massive, state-of-the-art industrial engine just humming with precision. Now imagine that this entire brilliant engine is forced to rely on a single, fragile garden hose for its fuel. For Japan, that metaphorical garden hose is a very real place, the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's dive into the daily numbers, because they're pretty wild. Japan is pulling in roughly 3.1 million barrels of oil every single day. And if we break down where that's coming from, roughly 95% comes straight from the Middle East. The concentration is just extreme. You've got Saudi Arabia providing 39%, the UAE at 34%, and Kuwait and Qatar making up another 15%.
Now, here's the stat that's frankly terrifying for policymakers in Tokyo. Approximately 80% of those total oil imports, along with huge amounts of liquefied natural gas, absolutely must transit through that 21-mile garden hose I mentioned earlier, the Strait of Hormuz.
So what actually happens when somebody pinches that hose? Well, we saw exactly what that looks like during the March 2026 Hormuz crisis. The strait was mined, commercial shipping essentially collapsed overnight, and in an instant, 88% of Japan's oil supply was disrupted. The ripple effect was immediate, with Brent crude surging to $126 a barrel shortly after.
The financial fallout from squeezing that choke point is just immediate, and it's devastating. Pre-crisis, Japan's annual energy import bill was already a massive $180 billion, but post-crisis pricing threatened to add up to $300 billion to that annual bill. The yen severely weakens, the trade deficit explodes, and factories across the country face an incredibly uncertain fuel supply.
Now, to buy some time and keep the economy from completely seizing up, Japan hit the emergency button and activated its Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is actually the second largest reserve in the world, holding a massive 470 million barrels of oil. Releasing this was absolutely critical to keep the lights on and the trucks moving.
But, and this is a massive but, that huge reserve, it really only buys them a 200-day buffer of net imports. You have to remember, it's designed for temporary disruptions, not sustained, open-ended crises. If a disruption pushes past 6 months, Japan begins drawing down those reserves to critically uncomfortable levels, basically pushing the country toward economic starvation.
Let's put this into historical perspective. Japan's actually been here before, right? During the 1973 oil shock, the Seikyu Shoku, they saw a massive 23% inflation spike. But look at the difference in scale here. In 1973, Japan was a $430 billion economy. Today, it's a $4.2 trillion economy. It's nearly 10 times larger. That means the absolute economic exposure and the potential for a true catastrophe is proportionally way greater today than it was 50 years ago.
Section 1. The search for alternatives. Can Japan power itself?
So Japan's response has obviously been to aggressively diversify, but you'll see every single alternative hits a hard ceiling. Australian LNG is great because it bypasses Hormuz entirely, but it doesn't replace oil. Renewables provide about 22% of their electricity, but expanding that is really constrained by Japan's mountainous geography. And sure, Japan is a global leader in hydrogen tech, but that's an aspirational moonshot for 2050. None of these things can quickly replace the 80% of energy flowing through the Middle East right now.
This kind of vulnerability inevitably brings up Japan's most politically explosive debate, nuclear energy. Pre-Fukushima, Japan relied on 54 reactors for 30% of its electricity. Post-Fukushima, as we know, that plummeted.
By 2026, only 12 reactors were providing 7 to 8%. However, the Hormuz crisis objectively shifted public opinion. Facing surging prices, polls showed the public began favoring energy security over safety concerns, which led Prime Minister Takachi to push for expedited safety reviews and restarts. But here is the vital catch, and it's a big one. Even if Japan restarted every single reactor and got back to 100% full capacity, nuclear reactors just generate electricity. They don't fuel cars, they don't power cargo ships, and they definitely don't fly aircraft. Japan would still be fundamentally reliant on importing massive amounts of oil and gas for its transportation and industrial sectors.
Section 2. The Autonomy Trap. Hostage to the sea lanes.
Japan's absolute non-negotiable need to keep that oil flowing explains so much about their foreign policy. It's exactly why they maintained economic ties with Iran until 2019 despite U.S. sanctions. It's why they invest billions in Middle East sovereign wealth and construction. It explains their muted criticism of Saudi Arabia's domestic policies. And crucially, it's why Japan hosts 54,000 U.S. troops. It's not just for regional defense, it's to ensure the U.S. Navy has a vested direct interest in keeping those shipping lanes open for Japanese tankers.
But, as the 2026 crisis starkly demonstrated, American and Japanese strategic goals, they don't always perfectly line up. The U.S. Navy was in the Gulf to enforce blockades and clear mines for its own strategic reasons, not specifically to act as a private security escort for Japanese oil. And this really exposed the severe limits of Tokyo relying entirely on Washington for its energy security.
Which brings us to a really terrifying question. Actually, it's the kind of thing that keeps strategic planners up at night. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz isn't the only maritime choke point Japan needs to worry about?
Think back to that 80% figure for a second. Roughly 80% of Japan's oil and LNG coming from Southeast Asia and Australia goes through a totally different but equally critical choke point, the Strait of Malacca.
And that sets the stage for the ultimate nightmare scenario, a dual disruption. Say you have a situation like a Taiwan contingency. If China were to interdict shipping in the South China Sea, it could effectively close the Malacca route. You combine that with a disruption at Hormuz, and boom, you have cut off almost all viable maritime energy supply routes. Japan would face rapid, catastrophic energy starvation within months.
At the end of the day, all this diversification, the massive reserves, the diplomatic alliances, they're really just managing the supply chain risk. They aren't eliminating it. Because, as the foundational thesis goes, a country that imports 97% of its energy can never be truly strategically autonomous. Japan remains enormously vulnerable to any state, or even non-state actor, capable of disrupting maritime routes.
And that perfectly brings us back to our core theme today, the Japanese paradox. It's the single most important structural weakness of any major power. The most technologically advanced economy in Asia, a true global titan, remains fundamentally dependent on others for the very fuel required for its survival. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Just how vulnerable is Japan's energy position moving forward, and what realistic steps could a nation even take when its geography offers almost zero domestic fuel? I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this paradox down in the comments. And hey, don't forget to subscribe for our next explainer, where we'll be diving into Japan's shifting strategic identity. See you there.